this little brain, this 3-pound organ, which is 2% of body's weight, actually consumes 25% of body's energy. Like every other number you hear off the cuff, that's not completely accurate. Reality is actually consumes more at times. It depends on the kind of thinking we're doing. And that consumption of energy is what overwhelms the brain, which was not expected to survive past 30, 40. We were expected to, as I've used this joke over and over again, reproduce, run away from tigers and bears, and then die fairly quickly thereafter. But we are doing fairly well with survival. With Dr. Fleming and other people's contribution, we're living past our 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. And let me tell you how much beyond. Right now in the United States, we have 80,000 centenarians. And that number is expected to grow to more than 600,000 by 2050. That's if we have no further cures for heart disease, cancers, and those kind of diseases. So we are headed for an aging society, which I think is extremely important and something very positive. And there's a flaw in that thought process behind that, because whenever I say that the fact that we want to live longer, there's always this social, political, contextual resistance to that fact. And I always say that successful cognitive aging, which is a paper I wrote, a review paper, the most painful review paper I've ever done in my life with Dilip Jeste, who's the head of Stein Aging Institute, Successful Cognitive Aging. A successful ager in his or her 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond is a completely different species than an 18-year-old. And I always make sure that there are no 18-year-olds in the room. And that's where we want to be. We want to actually get to that stage where we are actually successfully aging, especially cognitively. So that's the dilemma that we have, is that the population is getting older, yet our approach to aging is still linear, myopic, singular, molecular. And that's where we're failing over and over again. And there are examples of successful agers all around us. So as recently we lost an amazing gentleman, Dr. Wareham, who at age 104 passed away, but he was incredibly successful in his life and how he did his surgery and how he retired afterwards at the age of 95 and beyond. But there are many examples like him, Jane Goodall, Linus Pauling, many, many others who have aged successfully. Now, don't get me wrong. As we get older, certain things do change. And when I say get older, I mean past the age of 20. Because if you don't do the right things, let me just stop. Aging process or degenerative aging process versus restorative, rejuvenative aging process, two different pathways, starts in your 20s. If you don't do the right things, it's not magical thinking. It will fall apart, especially your brain that consumes 25% of the energy in a closed system beyond the walls of blood-brain barrier. It will degrade after the age of 20. We know that you lose thousands of cells per week in your 20s, once the myelination is complete. And there are different people have different degeneration, even in their 20s and 30s. So what you start doing early on matters, but try telling that to a 20-year-old. So, but the good news is that process of rejuvenation can start at any age. And that's because of the resilience of this amazing, amazing brain. But before we get to that point, we have a big tsunami ahead of us. Many of you have experienced that in your own lives, and all of you will, in one way or another, fairly soon, which is the tsunami of dementia. Dementia is the umbrella category. By rough definition, is when you have cognitive decline, be it visual-spatial, attention, executive, memory, or all of the above, to the extent where you can't do some of your daily activities you could do before. Just a rough definition. There are much more specific definitions if you go neuropsychological definition, but that's the rough definition. But there are different kinds of dementias. You have the Alzheimer's dementia, Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal lobe dementia, Parkinson's dementia, Huntington's dementia, many, many others. But the biggest one is Alzheimer's. Nearly 60 to 70% of all dementias is Alzheimer's. This is the big tsunami. And this is the biggest epidemic in the first world. Let me tell you how big. So right now, we have 5.8 million people suffering with Alzheimer's in the United States. That number is expected to grow exponentially. Every 60 seconds, 66 seconds, but a person is diagnosed with Alzheimer's. That's an understatement because many communities still don't have that, the idea of what Alzheimer's is. They just call it normal aging and they never go to the doctor for it. So every 66 seconds. It's the third leading cause of mortality, morbidity in the United States. Number one in UK and number one in Japan and other first world countries, and will be number one here. Every family will experience it in one way or another. And this number is expected to grow exponentially. Whereas we're succeeding in surviving diseases like diabetes and heart disease and cancer. It doesn't mean they're declining. We're surviving them better. Just mortality from Alzheimer's has grown by 123% in the last 15 years. And that exponential parabolic growth, or half parabolic, will continue to grow. And we have nothing for it. The false sense of security that we have Aricept, Namenda, Exelon, I'm talking myself out of a job, is false sense of security. Not even the pharmaceutical companies claim that they have any disease-modifying or disease-abating qualities. Not at all, zero. They're just symptomatic for a few years. And if you read the statistics, the symptom treatment component is so minimal that it's disturbing. But we still give it because it has some benefits, but not as far as changing the curve. And the cost is profound. So the second costliest disease in the United States is heart disease at $125 billion or so. Third leading costliest disease is all cancers combined, between $57 to $60 billion. Alzheimer's alone, by itself, direct cost $250 billion, indirect cost another $240 billion now. At a time that we don't even talk about it enough. It's 4 times bigger than the second leading costliest disease. But the cost to communities, to families, is much more enormous. I saw it in my own life, my wife. In fact, that's how we met, thousands of miles away from here. Her grandfather, the most brilliant man I knew, prime minister of a country, died of Alzheimer's. My grandfather, brilliant philosopher, politician, died of Alzheimer's. And I remember at that time, we had a land in Frederick, Maryland for hunting, and we were sitting, and this brilliant genius forgot how to move a knight in a chess table. And the shock to the entire family, bunch of surgeons and doctors, just overwhelming. And still it affects me. So that was the initiative, and we all will experience that if we don't change our perspective. And the perspective we're taking is molecular. We've been chasing one molecule, and now 2, amyloid, and now tau. We're not saying that those are not involved in the disease process, not at all. But we're saying that they're not the ultimate mover of the disease. And I'll show you, or I'll talk to you, it doesn't matter whether it's there or not. How it is critical that we start changing that perspective. We should still do research on amyloid and tau. And the approach, and I've those poor mice, I've guillotined a bunch of them myself. The approach is create a disease model, which means that the disease, therefore let's create the disease model. If we knew it, we would have solved it. But you create a genetic model of the disease in the mouse, which is the lifespan is 2 years anyway. And then you give something to reverse it. And lo and behold, we're brilliant. 70 items have worked in mouse models of Alzheimer's, including blueberries. None, 0, have transferred to human models because mice do not man-make. It's the wrong model. It's the wrong model at so many levels. And we've failed billions and billions of dollars of research by following this approach. That should be an approach. The molecular approach should be one of the approaches, but it's a false model. And that's the fallacy. The big myth is that Alzheimer's cannot be reversed in any other way except through pills. I'll stop here by saying that I'm not against pills. I give anxiety-reducing medicines to my patients because I think that quality of life at the time when a person already has the fulminant disease, that's the bigger factor. I give blood pressure management medications. I give cholesterol and with a perspective. But we have to hold it true to its outcome, the concept of validity. Is this thing truly doing what it's intending to do? We forget validity as scientists. So that approach, that's a fallacy, that it's not reversible, and we'll show it. The second fallacy is that it's a genetic disease. Is it a genetic disease? Of course, everything is genetic. Every cell in your body, except the red blood cells after they go through their process, have genes directing them, affecting them. But different diseases are influenced by genes in different ways. Certain diseases, such as Huntington's disease, the genes, chromosome 4, CAG repeats, have high penetrance, meaning that if you have that gene, you will get the disease. Sickle cell, Huntington's, many other diseases. But for many chronic diseases of aging, not just Alzheimer's, but for many of the others, genes do not dictate outcome directly. They give you a range of risk. And if I had, that was the one slide that was important. Recently, with new techniques in genetics, such as GWAS, which is genome-wide analysis, and other techniques, we kind of know what genes are involved in Alzheimer's. So up to now, we've identified nearly 25 genes that have influence in the disease process. Of these 25 genes, only 3 have the high penetrance that I was talking about. Meaning if you get those Alzheimer's genes, you'll get the disease before the age of 65, 70, no matter what you do. Those are presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and APP. So you'll get the disease if you have those genes. What percentage of Alzheimer's patients do you think have those 3 genes, or one of those 3 genes? 3%. 3%. So what about the other 90 to 97%? Well, they're influenced by a range of genes. One of the more well-known ones, and also one that has a little higher penetrance or influence, is ApoE4. How many people here know about ApoE4? Yeah. So ApoE4 is a gene that has to do with lipid transport. I'm simplifying the concept. It's much more than that, but mainly lipid transport. So lipid transport system, now we know many other proteins, but those is ApoE2, ApoE3, ApoE4. If you have the ApoE2 gene, both from 2 parents, you're significantly protected against Alzheimer's and other vascular diseases. That's a clue to the disease onset and factors that influence disease. ApoE3 is a wash. ApoE4, if you get one allele or one gene from one parent, your risk goes up 4 times. If you get 2 genes, your risk goes up anywhere between 12 to 20 times. So what about those that have 2 genes? Well, what percentage of the population has 2 genes? 2%. And of them, since you have 2 genes, up to 20% increased risk. That means that if you live long enough, you're going to get the disease, right? No. 50% never develop the disease, even in this high penetrance genes. So what happened? I'll make the case about lifestyle. So even with the ApoE4, what about the other genes, the other 20 or so genes? So we know now that there are clusters of genes involved. You have the vascular response genes. You have the immune, that's a big category, immune response genes. And then the other category is the lysosomal storage genes and energy metabolism genes, 4 categories. So what's the significance of these genes? So if you're talking about, yes. Oh, fantastic. Good. I thought you had a question. OK. So there's the brain. Let's see what I missed. And 87 billion neurons. I got this. You want me to use this? OK. I'll do that. So 87 billion neurons, 1 quadrillion potential connections. And when people say we only use 10% of our brain, wrong. We use 100% of our brain at 1% efficiency. And I'll tell you what that means. And it's an incredible, overpowered machine for what we do. which is click the TV station and do that kind of stuff. So in any case, we'll go past this. Let's see how true I was to there. Okay, good. Oh, I missed this point. There are some differences in populations as far as risk. Women have a higher risk of Alzheimer's, and African Americans and Hispanics have a higher risk, 4 times for African Americans and 2.7 to 3 times for Hispanics. But my argument is that actually that's an understatement in those populations, and it speaks not so much to gender differences and racial differences, but the lifestyle factors that I'll speak to in a bit. And the cost of Alzheimer's, if we don't do anything, will rise to $3 trillion by 2050, which means by itself it will collapse our system in general, forget not just healthcare system. Amyloid and tau, 100% failure, and here's the genetic picture that I was trying to show you. So these genes that have to do with energy metabolism means that your body's response to high energy, it's either good or bad. Of course, it's not a binary concept. Let's get rid of binaries. It's a range. And if it's bad, and if you overutilize energy, too much fat, too much energy, you're going to overwhelm the system. The lysosomal storage genes have to do with your body's ability to get rid of waste. So if you produce too much waste through inflammation, oxidation, glucose, then you'll overwhelm the system. Vascular response and immune response. If you have bad genes, if you overwhelm it, you'll have difficulty. There are those that have good genes, and you always hear that. Oh, forget about smoking. My uncle lived to 100 and he was still smoking. Your uncle was an exception. We don't create public health around your uncle. So the bell curve, it's difficult to explain the bell curve to people. But so if those are the genes, and they're not Alzheimer's genes, but your body's response to those different factors, what does that mean? That means that these genes determine your lifestyle, or are determined by your lifestyle. There's a statement that your genes are like a gun that's loaded, and lifestyle is you pulling the trigger. Horrible analogy, but that's the only one that came to mind. But that's the way this is definitely in Alzheimer's. These are all your body's response to those different factors. The 2 pathways that we can take as we get older. I did say starting age 20, but at any age, because of those 1 quadrillion connections, and I'll tell you why those are so important at any age. Either we start having cognitive decline in your 20s, and then you won't notice in your 20s. In your 30s, you won't notice it. In your 40s, you start forgetting some keys. Don't ask. It's a great thing my wife wasn't here. She would tell you how many times I've forgotten my coat, my keys, and I just attribute it to being overwhelmed or too much to do. But then you continue having more and more until you have MCI, which is mild cognitive impairment. By definition, MCI is when you're making mistakes with memory, with remembering, or executive problems, enough where everybody else and some other people notice it, but yet you still don't have dementia by the fact that you still can do everything, driving, finances, things of that nature. But that group, MCI, has a 60% risk of going on to developing dementia. So, but the other choice is this. This choice is conferred to us by resilience or cognitive reserve. There's a brain reserve that you develop in your first 5 years of life. My wife and I have written about that, the importance of first 5 years of life. People think, we think that it just happens. It doesn't. The environment has significant influence on overlaying the genetics of a child. And that, at age 3 or 4, there's actually a process called apoptosis, programmed cell death. And that programmed cell death is partially determined by genetics, partly by environment. And what's left behind is the architecture of your brain, and that's important. IQ, attention, focus, and all of that stuff. And that cognitive brain reserve continues to be affected well into your middle school and high school. What's funny is, I'm going to give a little clue and jump on the side. We send, so in any case, that's significant, but what's more significant is cognitive reserve, which is what we do thereafter. Because the number of cells are not as significant as the number of connections. Now, these 87 billion neurons each can make a few connections, or each can make as many as 30,000 connections. When people compare the brain to a muscle, I say such a disservice to a brain. Biggest guy you know is twice bigger than he could have been, right? Not really, but let's say. But 30,000 connections per neuron, that's the level of protection that's not overcome by anything. And I'll show you studies like Nun studies and others that actually show that. That redundancy, that connectivity is cognitive reserve, and that's significant. And that actually grows throughout life. As you get older, there's a little bit of slowing of processing, encoding, and recall. But it's so small, so nominal, that it doesn't affect your life if you avoid the pathology. But where you do grow is in vocabulary and what I call three-dimensional thinking. It used to be called wisdom, but we'll call it three-dimensional thinking, rename it. So when we wrote the book Alzheimer Solution, initially there was resistance. This is 4 years ago. We were asked by BBC Breakfast to come to England, UK, to talk in BBC Breakfast. For those of you who know, that's the biggest show in the world. So we were excited, 45 minutes. And on the way there, their equivalent of Alzheimer's Association called them and said, this is too controversial, saying that lifestyle affects brain health. So on the phone, back and forth, they reduced our time to 10 minutes. The only saving grace was that ABBA, the group, ABBA, I'm a fan, they were there before us, so that was the whole trip was that. But 10 minutes, and we were kind of distraught because the data is replete, and I'll show you. This is just some of the data I'm going to show you is a fraction of all the data that we have on the influence of lifestyle and brain health. And the good news is, last year, we were in Alzheimer's International Conference, and the central topic, the plenary talk, the keynote speech was about prevention is the new treatment. Lifestyle. Lifestyle, lifestyle, lifestyle. So they've changed. And Alzheimer's Association is putting $20 million into lifestyle research. AARP is putting $60 million. They'll do it badly, as always, in systematic, linear ways, but that's the direction we're taking. So what are the processes that are involved, given that genetic profile that I showed you, and the data that we've seen? What are the things that are involved in brain aging? This is actually something that it can be used in many other diseases as well, but for brain aging, it's usually energy metabolism, or poor energy metabolism, lipid dysregulation, inflammation, and oxidation. Now, those four processes are not separate. This is a closed system. They're always involved and interactive. Sometimes one of them is upstream and the other one is downstream, and vice versa. As it happens, inflammation is usually one that's further downstream and common to all of them. But people come to this disease, or Alzheimer's or vascular, from different pathways. And that's why this chaos that's been going on, Reese Sperling and the Harvard group, for a long time were calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes because they found insulin resistance. And we actually just did this year 2 papers on insulin resistance, and in Haynes and a nationwide data that you can find on PubMed. Yeah, is insulin resistance involved in the cognitive decline in general, and even in Parkinson's and even Alzheimer's? Absolutely. But is that the disease? No. It's one pathway. How about lipid dysregulation, fats? Absolutely, that's a different pathway. And then what about inflammation as a first primary path? Well, we're dealing with the retired football players. We did at Sears and now here as well. And with people who have traumatic brain injury repeatedly, inflammation seems to be the driver. So it's all of those, depending on which direction. So it's a disease that you can come to it from different directions. So what are the remedies for energy metabolism, or lack of energy good metabolism, lipid dysregulation, inflammation, and oxidation? Fairly simple. No drugs yet. And if there are going to be drugs, and there will be, it's going to be a combination drugs, depending on your journey, your epigenetics, and where you are in that journey. And that's look at that three-dimensionality is going to be complex. And it's not going to be one antibody against amyloid. We seem to throw antibodies against everything now. Absolutely useful in many diseases like cancer. But this is too complex. So until then, we have the things that truly affect energy, lipids, inflammation, oxidation. It's nutrition, it's exercise, and these are not, when the numbers, you see the numbers, these are not nominal facts. It's stress management, and stress management is not what you think I'm going to say. And it's sleep. We call it restorative sleep, the ultimate spa. So, and then the fifth one is separate from this, it doesn't affect this process, is mental activity, optimizing mental and social activity. And I'll warn you ahead of time, it's not Sudoku. So, yeah. So those four, I call it 4+1. And as a result, we came with this acronym. Everybody has to have a catchy acronym, Neuro. It's self-serving. I'm being neurologist, my wife and I. N for nutrition, E for exercise, U for unwind, R for restorative sleep, not just sleep. I can knock anybody out, but it doesn't mean that they've had restorative sleep. And O for optimizing mental and social activity. So starting with nutrition. Nutrition is critical, central to all of this. How could it not be? Something that you consume 3 to 5 times a day that makes or breaks your body. Can increase inflammation or reduce inflammation. Every meal. There are studies at NIH where they've brought people into the lab and they've given them food, and right afterwards they measured their inflammation, glucose dysregulation, all of these things. So every meal affects you, or it can damage your system. This is our food paradigm right now. Yeah. And we wanted to get to this. There's significant research, and I'm not going to go through all of it, and if you guys want, we have more than 300 papers that cite different factors. But there are many studies, such as this Monica study, which looked at cholesterol, 1,449 participants aged 65 to 79. They looked at the effect of ApoE4 versus cholesterol. And although ApoE4 by itself increased risk, when you did stratification, cholesterol levels by themselves increased the risk twice as much beyond the ApoE4 status. 3 times. The Chicago Health and Aging Study, 2,500 individuals, higher amounts of saturated and trans fatty acids, higher risk by 6 years. It's not a small study, 2,500 people. The Advanced Health Study, Paul Guillaume's study that looked at different kind of foods, plant-based versus non-plant-based, it was demonstrated that it increased the risk by 2 times as much. This is the Kaiser Permanente study, nearly 10,000 individuals. High cholesterol rate increased your risk by 57%, and even borderline by 23%. Now, before these thoughts are going in your mind that did they control for X, Y, and Z, these are well-founded studies in Harvard, Chicago, and Kaiser Permanente. So they took all the what we call confounders into consideration, and the studies are large enough to be powered to take all those things into consideration. And despite all of that, the significant increased risk from just elevated cholesterol, even borderline increased your chance by 23%. This is the Women's Health Study, which shows 6,000 individuals. A higher saturated fat diet increased your risk by 70% and decline in memory, and their brains were 6 years older when higher fat versus lower fat diet. This is the the Northern Manhattan study. My wife, when she did her fellowship in Columbia University, she was part of this. Again, researchers in Columbia, they found that participants who ate plant-based diet had a lower risk of cognitive decline over a span of 6 years compared to those who ate the standard American diet, SAD diet. The MIND diet. How many people know about the MIND diet? It's a combination of the Mediterranean diet with the low-salt diet for heart. And again, same thing. Moderate adherence reduce your risk by 35%, but strict adherence reduce your risk by 53%. Not a small study. This is the study that we're about to publish. She's the first author, California Teacher Study, 133,000 people. This is she won the American Heart Association Award for this. 133,000 people over 25 years. And looked at Mediterranean diet. Everybody is interested in Mediterranean diet. It was just actually touted as the best diet by US World Report. Of course, you want to go by US World Report as your diet. And all these others. So what do you think was the part of Mediterranean diet that was effective? So we did factor analysis, seeing what elements. When you have 133,000 individuals, you can do factor analysis, go into the strata. Guess what parts of the diet was most effective? Plant-based, and I'll show you that. And it was able to reduce your chance of stroke by 44%. How many drugs do you have that can reduce your chance of stroke by 44%? Yeah. And the good news was that it wasn't all or none. So we stratified it to 9 levels as far as adherence was concerned. So even at level 1, you reduce your chance by 10% of that 44%. Level 2, 20% of that 40%. So it's not a binary thing, which is great for patients, because I hate the concept of doctors who are usually not trained in nutrition go into a clinic and say, eat healthy, and walk out. First of all, that creates failure, because you actually disempower them. The studies show that you don't just disempower them from nutrition, you actually disempower them from taking pills, because they say, if this guy is saying that nutrition is important and all he said is eat healthy, what do I do? And then as far as the message of what kind of nutrition, it's never conveyed. And it's so inconsistent, especially with the noise that's being introduced by the paleo and keto and what I call the confirmation bias crowd. This is the kind of research that is created when people want to fit science into their wants. Everybody wants to know that bacon is medicine. It's not. And so the biggest problem in humanity is confirmation bias. And education doesn't get rid of confirmation bias. It just gives you better language to confirm your previous bias. So that's why the massive movement of keto, paleo, the data is just non-existent, especially long term. Yet it's overtaking 80 years of data that shows whole food plant-based diet is by far protective for heart disease, diabetes, and now cognitive diseases, stroke, and dementia. So when we did the stratification of what part of the Mediterranean diet was effective, and we looked at other studies, when they looked at Mediterranean diet, what were they looking at? It wasn't the cheese, wine, and the fish. It was vegetables, fruits, whole grains, nuts, legumes, and omega-3. Often they use fish as a replacement, but any omega source of omega-3 was a factor. And what took points away from your adherence? What took points away was meat, poultry, and dairy. So why is it that the media is not talking about this? Why is it that the study that, on the cover of Time magazine, you have butter is back with no data written by a journalist? Yet this paper that my wife did, which showed 133,000 people that whole food plant-based diet reduces your chance of stroke by 44%, doesn't get any traction. We know why. And that's where the good news as far as strata of improvement, meaning that if you took 1 step, it was still beneficial, 2 step was more beneficial. So that's important, because you can tell your patients, this is the optimal, and I'm not going to change that. But any steps toward the optimal is great. And you have to take your own journey. My least favorite English word is motivation, because it usually comes from people that were motivated to begin with and telling people that they're not motivated, basically. Because what is motivation? What is motivation? I always tell my daughter, my son and daughter are doing well in school, and my daughter came and she's taking the SAT at age 11, and she said, I'm not motivated, I'm terrible, I'm horrible. I said, what is motivation? Motivation is the most disempowering statement that we use with patients as well. The path to motivation is clear goal and 6 steps of success towards that goal. Then brain comes in and gives one of 2 big definitions. I like it or I don't like it. And if you create enough steps of success, that becomes motivational direction, a vector. That's it. Then my second least favorite word is moderation, which is the word everybody uses that wants to get out of a diet or a lifestyle or any change. Everything in moderation. What do you mean moderation? I grew up in Pittsburgh. I play football, soccer, tennis. I have the back spasm speaking to that football thing. Somebody's my size playing football. But, and I used to eat meat 5 times, 7 times a day, including beef jerky in the middle. This is Pittsburgh, remember. And I used to drive to Philly for Philly steak and cheese. And I will still say that the greatest food, I'm not that sophisticated, the greatest food on the planet is Philly steak and cheese. But I'm not going to fit my science to fit that want, right? So that's the problem we have is with moderation. There's no denominator. The goal is the goal. Whole food, plant-based. Because you can't change the science. But the steps toward that goal has to be individualized. It has to be where that person is. Where we work at SAC Clinic, where we have 30-year-olds come with strokes. 40-year-olds. Every Friday morning we have SAC Clinic. Every Friday morning, at least 1 or 2 40-year-olds with a stroke. Has nothing to do with genetics. They don't have moya disease. It's lifestyle. They have hemoglobin A1C of 12, cholesterol into 250s to 300s, blood pressures in the 180s, and that's considered well controlled. I tell people, especially as you get older, if your blood pressure is above 150, you're having mini strokes. It's not showing up clinically, but I'll show you the white matter change on your MRIs. This is lifestyle stuff that we have to start speaking to. So the lifestyle component, the stepwise is better than just saying eat healthy or go whole food plant-based. They're not. There's no way that that population that I see in SAC is going to go whole food plant-based overnight. They shouldn't. I take one variable, sugar. I take one variable, cheese. I take one factor, focusing on blood pressure and controlling that well. And then the next step and the next step, and that becomes a habit, and I'll speak to that. Supplements. Every day, not in SAC Clinic, but in our regular clinic, and definitely when we were in Cedars-Sinai, we were the directors of the Brain Center there, bags full of vitamins. Bags full of vitamins. And all these new books like Plant Paradox and others that are designed to create a disease and a pill for the disease. Lectins. How many people have heard about lectins? Look at this. We have more people hearing about lectins than ApoE4. So the whole book is about the fact that certain fruits have lectins and they're bad for you, including beans. How curious. The 5 blue zones, the central food is beans, yet that's bad for you. And before the book comes out, he has pills that are, wait for it, lectin-blocking pills. Genius as a businessman. So when we put out the book, the big problem was that we had no gimmicks. What vitamin is bad? What vitamin can we give? No, it's comprehensive lifestyle. I can't sell sleep. I can't sell whole food plant-based. I can't sell brisk walks, but that's what it is. We'll show you the numbers. Well, with nutrition, you saw this. Just nutrition, 53% reduction in a degenerative disease like Alzheimer's. Why is nobody talking about this? These are not small studies. Columbia University, Harvard study, nutrition. So, as far as supplements, there's no evidence at all. Will there be? Yes, but probably in synergy. What does that mean? So if you're B12 deficient, especially if you're going plant-based, but in general, even if you're not completely low, on the lower side, I say take B12. Omega and DHA, there's good evidence for different bodies, but not as much as we thought initially for heart, but definitely for brain, there's evidence. So omega DHA, and at the end, with the questions, I'll tell you about quantity and all that. And then there's some level 3 science on turmeric, curcumin. Specific. When we were at Cedars, we did a study with retinal scans that actually measured the retina. So if you get curcumin to traverse the blood-brain barrier, it actually binds to amyloid. So you can actually see it in retina. And we can quantify it. And whenever there was binding, there was actually a removal of that amyloid, if that's a marker. So turmeric is an anti-inflammatory. And why turmeric instead of curcumin? Because it has way more elements than just curcumin that's beneficial. So, and the quantities you can find anywhere. But beyond that, there's actually no data. And more importantly, there's data about synergy of these vitamins, meaning that it wasn't just B12. When B12 was low, but you didn't replace the DHA, it wasn't as effective when you did both. There's evidence in other diseases like lung cancer, those who had risk in populations that had high vitamin A levels, they had lower risk. So Makes sense to give people who smoke vitamin A, right? What happened? More lung cancer. What about vitamin E and prostate cancer? People who had vitamin E had lower risk of prostate cancer, so let's give them vitamin E. What happened? Higher risk. The reason is that your body doesn't recognize vitamins in isolation as well. I'm not saying I'm completely against vitamins, so I'm not one of those conspiracy theories, all this is bad. No, it has to be, I love the concept of complexity, getting used to complexity. It's our natural tendency to simplify to one or two answers that's causing all of the world's problems. We'll leave that. But it's the complexity of nutrition and pills and everything together. We're not against blood pressure medicine. Absolutely, if somebody has blood pressure, the latest data that even minimal high blood pressure increased your chance of Alzheimer's by 20%. So manage blood pressure short term with blood pressure medicine, but blood pressure medicines don't change the underlying vascular nature. It's lifestyle that will do it over time. So medicine should be in the context of short-term versus long-term change. Same thing with vitamins. If somebody's B12 deficient, absolutely, but find alternative lifestyle because it's in synergy in a food form that these things work. And the data is repeated to show that. We'll pass this. One of our papers, was it this year or last year? Well, no, 2016. Nationwide data, diabetes. That's the glucose or energy metabolism. People with uncontrolled diabetes or even borderline controlled diabetes had a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's and definitely vascular dementia. And this is the paper we did last year, which in Haynes, which looked at insulin resistance independent of diabetes, or subtracted from, meaning that we made sure that the individuals didn't have diabetes, and we looked at just insulin resistance and its relationship to cognitive status. This wasn't a prospective study, so it was a cross-sectional, so we take that with all that means. And again, higher insulin resistance, lower cognitive status, even when controlling for education, all of that other variables that you control for. So there's evidence, and there's many other papers, not just by us, but others that show that it's not just diabetes or insulin resistance. That's a factor. It's not just cholesterol and fat. That's a factor. It's not just inflammation. That's a factor. That's not a popular talk, is it? You're just asking too much from us. Control the sugar, control the fat, control the inflammation, and no pills to reverse it. Well, that's the reality of nutrition. More whole food, plant-based is better. Yep. So the ideal food, when you look at all these papers, over 80 years, as opposed to this new little island of data that they're doing meta-analysis. By the way, anytime you hear meta-analysis and you hear things that are completely contrary to what you've been used to, realize that we just did a meta-analysis on cognitive status and games, the largest meta-analysis of its type that was published in, this year. And meta-analysis is so fraught for manipulation. It depends on what you put into your analysis will determine what you get out of your analysis. So be careful with the meta-analysis. So it has to be across the board. Population studies, cross-sectional studies, retrospective studies, case control studies, randomized control studies, and then reviews. If all of them are pointing in one direction by different people of no influence or not being, then there's evidence, especially in the field of neurology. And the data is repeatedly showing whole food plant-based diet is significantly protective for brain health. And if you had to pick some things, it's green leafy vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, berries, nuts and seeds, beans and lentils, whole grains, herbs and spices, tea and coffee. I know, forget about the coffee part. Okay. Yeah. It's the science, I'm sorry. But it's, so it's critical to know this. And then the fats. So the saturated fats versus poly and monounsaturated fats, right? Doesn't mean that you know, my dad, nicest guy on the planet, he always wanted to be healthy. And one day I go to his car and there's a bag of, not a bag, one of those round containers of peanuts, this big, in his car. So he thought he had read somewhere that peanuts are good for you. And I said, how often does it take you to go through this? He said, I go through this in a week. He thought it was pills. No, just because, so poly and monounsaturated fats when you're consuming, it doesn't mean they're healthy to take in large amounts. A patient of mine came after I told him that olive oil is fine with a bottle of olive oil, virgin olive oil. He said, why? He said, I have 3 glasses of these a day. No, the data shows that excess olive oil even is inflammatory. So take that in small amounts. I was about to say moderation. No, in small amounts. As a, as a spritzer, as a lubricant, but not make it a medicine. It's not medicine. So in small amounts, even nuts, it shouldn't be taken more than a fistful. And there's a little bit more complexity. Also depends on your your cholesterol levels, your sugar levels. So you do adjustments there. But the optimal is minimal of those. So that's and work towards. So we talk about, in order to empower the patients, we say WTI, WTE. Work towards increasing, work towards eliminating. Not just eliminate right away. And take one habit at a time. And I'll talk about habits at the end if I have time. Sugar, bad. I'm talking about white sugar, processed sugar, juices, and even honey. Yes, I don't know why people think just because it comes from a bee it's healthy. I guess it's cool. Pastries, sweets, cheeses, dairies, and extracted oils. Yes, olive oil, not olive oil, coconut oil. It's not good for you. Anecdote of one. And it's incredible how, because people thought that they could eat anything, but if they had coconut oil, it solved everything. It's easy, it's interesting, it's from the islands, it must be good, It's not. It's 90% saturated fat. And the MCT part is being studied, but not in conjunction with olive oil. There's no data. In fact, it was these movements are so destructive that Walter Willett and the Harvard group actually just wrote a consensus paper speaking to all of that, including separate section on coconut oil. So the extracted oils are not beneficial. So more fruits, more vegetables, less saturated fat, less sugar. Exercise. Exercise is extremely important, whereas nutrition, sleep, and stress management creates the environment for brain growth. Because if it's not ready for that environment, if it's undergoing shock and inflammation, nothing else can be reconstructed. But exercise and mental activity actually grows the brain. Yes, growth. Not cellular growth. As much as there was a time we thought there was no growth in the brain. There is. There are some cells that grow. But the growth is not that significant. What is important, it's not the cellular growth. It's axonal and connections, dendritic connections. And those connections happen at any age and at the level I told you, 30,000 per cell. So that's where you see growth. And when I say growth, I don't mean post hoc autopsy growth that you see under a microscope. Actual growth you see on MRIs, and we'll tell you a couple of studies. So one study, Framingham longitudinal study, just looked at, even recently, again, daily brisk walk, with the operative term being brisk. Reduced your chance of Alzheimer's by 40%. The reason I say brisk is because everybody, we ask, you say, oh, I'm fine, I work out all day. I say, what do you do? I garden, I walk the neighborhood, I walk the dog. That's fantastic, but that's meditation. That's not exercise. The data shows you have to get tired. You really have to get tired. And by tired, I don't mean, of course, check with your cardiologist or whatever, but I don't want to be sued from the crowd, but it's not measuring your pulse and subtracting your age and all of that. It's about short of breath where you have difficulty finishing a sentence. That's good enough. So work towards that. And again, work towards it. When patients come to me, I say, no matter how much you can do, for the next 2 weeks, you're just going to walk briskly for 5 minutes so that the habit sets in. And then you go 6 minutes and 7 minutes. You didn't get here overnight. You shouldn't try to change overnight. So it's got to be at least 6 months. Study of, in 2010, meta-analysis of 15 studies, nearly 34,000 people. High level of physical activity could lower risk of cognitive decline by 38%. Even lower levels reduce the cognitive decline by as much as 35%. This is research investigated the effects of exercise on 639 elderly, vascular, as well as other forms of cognitive decline. Those who exercised had 40% lower risk of cognitive impairment and dementia, as well as 60% lower risk of vascular dementia. What time is it? Are we in time? Let me just get past. So there are lots of studies on exercise. By the way, isn't it interesting that there's no controversy with exercise? Nobody's coming up with paid meta-analysis saying that if you sit in your chair all day, you're going to be protected against Alzheimer's because you're not taking away the bacon from them. Yeah. So again, the effect on inflammation, the effect on BDNF and GDNF, brain-derived growth factors, repeatedly, nearly in other studies, resistance training, showed a 47% reduction in cognitive decline from MCI and reversal of MCI, which is remarkable. So what are the exercises that are really, so far? And my favorite concept is to the best of our knowledge today. I think it's the most humble statement. As a scientist, I don't need, this is the best of our knowledge, and I'm okay with that. And the best of our knowledge today is, one, aerobic exercise significantly, a lot more than you thought. So work towards 25 to 30 minutes of aerobic exercise 4 to 5 days a week. But work towards it. The New Year resolution doesn't work for anybody, has never worked for anybody, so work towards it. Second is, even if you worked out half an hour a day, but you sat for 8 hours in a row or 6 hours in a row, it negated the benefit. Move, get up, stretch, not right now, after the talk, and get moving throughout the day. Standing chairs, walking all day long. And thirdly, this was a little bit surprising, although it's not in retrospect. I can create hypotheses around it to be tested. Leg strength was associated with brain health. And it wasn't a directional thing. I know that scientists here would think, oh no, they were healthier, therefore they had brain. No, even directionality adjusted, leg strength had to do with brain health and bigger brains. So if you're going to do any strengthening exercise, leg strength. So squats, lunges, or walks, or bikes. My favorite exercise is bike, because I think that running by itself can be traumatic to the brain if you do lots of it. We did a podcast with Rich Roll, a brilliant guy who did 5 ultra runs in 5 days at age 50. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that I think that can't be healthy, doing ultra runs, but in any case, biking. So leg strength is extremely important. So those 3 things can reduce your chance at the lowest number by 40%. But forget about Alzheimer's. We're not even talking about that. Maintaining cognitive health. So there you have nutrition 53%, exercise 40%. Let's say if you even reduce it. Why aren't more people talking about this? The data is all over the place. So the next thing is stress. And I'm going to surprise you here. It's not about bad stress. It has to do with good stress. So bad stress will shrink the brain, study after study, many studies, even from childhood. It will actually, especially the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which are the memory areas of the brain. Many studies, as much as 14% reduction in hippocampus and impaired hippocampal memory as a result of stress. The BDNF levels, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factors, go down significantly with stress. And many other studies. And the more important thing here is identifying good stress versus bad stress. Why is that important? Because the most protective individuals, even beyond nutrition and diet and everything else, were people who were mentally active throughout life. Why? Because they had the most connections. Let me give you a bad analogy, but I'll give you an analogy anyway. Here's a piece of memory, and you're trying to get to it. There are 2 connections, right? 2 neurons, 2 connections. One of them is severed as a result of a late night party. I don't know those things. Second one as a result of lack of sleep a couple of nights in a row. Gone. What happened to that piece of memory? Gone. Now, what if you had 30,000 connections? What can sever that memory? I'm writing a book about human behavior. At the core is what's called islands of consciousness. These islands of awareness that actually create your ultra or meta-awareness consciousness. And it's related to these connections. And the more connections you have, the better. And you don't get the connections by just sitting around watching TV. You get it through stress. When you're getting a higher degree, that's stressful, yet that's the most protective. When you're volunteering, when you're running a company, when you're running these activities that challenge your brain, they're not without stress, but they're good stress. So good stress is the kind of stress that's driven by your purpose, and that word's going to come back over and again, that has direction, that has steps of success, This kind of stress actually builds the brain. And bad stress is the opposite, which has no direction, not driven by your purpose, and it can destroy. And how is that possible? So your limbic system, which is your emotional pathways, is actually connected to your hypothalamus, which is then connected to your pituitary. So the definition of stress is taking place in your hippocampus and frontal lobe, or limbic system and frontal lobe. If it's a good stress, you feel good about it. It actually sends different signals to the hypothalamus, which actually releases different kind of chemicals from pituitary. For those of you who are not physicians, pituitary is the organ that releases, controls the thyroid, growth hormone, insulin, every process in your body. And when it's good stress, your oxytocin levels go down, cortisol levels go down, oxytocin goes up, cortisol levels go down, adrenaline goes down, your thyroid levels are stabilized. If it's bad stress, it's the opposite. And we see this, and that's significant because every moment, your perception of that stress can affect that pathway. That's a significant fact. Just because it's complex, we can't just close our eyes to it. But it's there, it's important. So the most important thing I tell people is to do one of three things. One is identify, in our household, there are 2 neurologists and 2 kids, whiteboards everywhere. Every minute they get up, this is my negative stress, and be specific. I love the concept of SMART goals. Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to a higher goal, and time-bound. Write down, is this thing you're doing, is it good stress or bad stress? And they list it out, the kids do. And that's important to increase the good stress and reduce the bad stress. And your whole life should be around the good stress. That's the highest protection. It's such a, when the group that had the greatest decline in cognition, it will surprise you who that group was. It was the group that was most highly functional, the CEOs and the titans of industry and leaders, and then they retired and they didn't do anything for 2 years. They had the steepest decline, because all those connections, when they're not challenged continually, they wither away. So challenge yourself. I think I'm speaking to the choir, so it's a good bet that this group is doing it. So identify your stresses. Multitasking. There is no such thing as multitasking. It seems like a little out of place statement here, but it's not, because multitasking is not good stress. We are designed for linear behavior. There is no such thing as multitasking. There's only doing multiple things badly, which creates stress, repeated stress, and mechanisms of destruction. Prioritize, first things first, and that's a part of the mechanism. And meditate, pray, create islands of true calm and focus. The whole meditation world, when we knew Chopra, and I'm not we're good friends, but I'm not part of that belief model. But the whole thing about meditation and mindful breathing and all these things is about ability to create focus, and that's it. Because the gatekeeper of consciousness is focus. The first parts of the brain that are affected when we age are the focus areas of the posterior cuneate. The first areas that are affected. And with pathology, those are the areas that are affected even more than memory centers. So work on focus. When you're younger, if you're not, eating a bunch of sugar and bad food, focus comes naturally. In fact, we destroy it in our systems. That's a different talk. But that's something to work on. If there's any cognitive area to work on, everybody, ubiquitously, it should be focus building, whatever that takes. So the next one is sleep. It's extremely important. We sacrifice security 8 hours a day for sleep. How could it not be extremely important? Those cycles, the 4 phases of sleep plus REM, are not just there, for a physical rest. It is the brain actually does some of its best work during sleep. Some papers, I'm a little late, so we'll get over the papers, but sleep has 2 functions. One is memory and memory consolidation. It takes the time to put the right memories that you've developed during the day into the right folders, files, and not just for that day, for the whole period before it. So a good 8 hours of sleep, 7 to 8 hours of sleep, which is actually the period that's been found to be beneficial, has significant effect on memory consolidation and improving memory and cognition. The second and more important function is detoxifying the brain. When we were in Cedars, we had a particular crowd, and they would come with detox of the day from every body pore you can imagine. It was gruesome. And we kept saying there are only 2 detoxes that we know of. 2 types. One is water. The second is sleep. During sleep, you actually see the levels of amyloid go down, inflammatory markers go down, the bad connections are severed. In fact, when you don't have good sleep, the microglia, which are called the janitor cells, actually are supposed to clean up the bad connections, and they actually start eating away from good brain tissue. That's why people who have chronic sleep deprivation have smaller brains. So those are the 2 functions of sleep. And it's critical that we create a sleep pattern through sleep hygiene and cognitive behavioral therapy and other techniques. And we say that if you take the time, 7 months, 6 months to a year, everybody can be taken off medicine and develop good sleep through these techniques over time. Last, and the most important, is optimizing mental activity. Many studies. How much time do I have? Done?
You're done.
Okay. Taxi driver study, and nun study, and many show that the connections that come about through cognitive activity are the highest, give you the highest protection. And that cognitive activity, we did the meta-analysis, and you can find that on Google or on PubMed, has to do with complexity, challenge, and purpose. Complexity means activities that are real-life complex activities. Learning a musical instrument, learning a language, managing something, volunteering. All these things are complex activities that involve all of the parts of the brain. Playing guitar, you're reading the music. That's your language center, Broca's and Wernicke's. You're processing it mentally, it's frontal lobe. Visually, it's occipital lobe. You're being creative, it's right parietal lobe. Emotionally involved, it's your limbic system. That's the entire brain and being active. That's no Sudoku. That's totality of the brain being challenged. And so I tell people, don't retire. If you're going to retire, pick an activity that challenges your entirety of the brain at least a couple of hours a day, and that's your highest protection. And complexity, challenge, and purpose. Purpose, because it makes it good stress. You don't want to do something that you don't like to do. No matter how challenging it is, it becomes bad stress and destructive. So find something that you love that challenges your brain, and that's the protection. We don't have time for habits, which is my favorite. I'm a neurobehaviorist, but I gave a clue to that. Small steps of success towards one behavior at a time create habit pathways. And if you have several habit pathways created, that becomes behavior. The habit, 99% of what we do, even thinking, is habit pathways, just reflex. And very little do we go to the cortex. And most of those habits were developed in you know when? During your teenage years. Really? You want teenage habits? So I tell people, start reprogramming the brain, but one small, smart habit at a time, specific, measurable. And then you will see that the pattern actually then magnifies and amplifies habit pathways. So with that, my wife and I are directors of Alzheimer's prevention program. It doesn't mean that we don't say we reverse Alzheimer's. We can't, nobody else can. Any book that says it is overstating it. What we say is, if you start early enough and complex enough, you can prevent or delay the disease significantly. That's our statement. So thank you so much for your time.
That was a brilliant talk. For anybody who wants to stay, we'll have some time for questions.
Yes.
Is anyone with any questions?
Yes. Oh.
Quick question. You skipped the fish slide.
The fish. So all the studies show that fish is not as bad as other meats, including chicken is pretty bad. But there's worry that of mercury and lead. But the problem is not just mercury and lead. Since 1940s, we've added 40,000 chemicals into the oceans. And now that they're testing for other chemicals, there is no clean source of fish. Because animals are concentrators. The bigger fish concentrate more. So if you're going to have fish, smash. Salmon, mackerel, anchovies. The other S is sardines and herring. Smash. But in small amounts, because we worry about that. The main benefit of fish seems to be the omega and DHA. So why not take that from a plant-based source? That's it. Yes.
So there's a book. Dale Bredesen.
Yes.
Are you familiar with his work?
I am very familiar with his work.
Can you comment on it?
I can, unabashedly and unfearfully. Anytime you have protocols that have vitamins connected to them, be wary. There are some good things in there. But first of all, great scientist, has 90 or so publications or more, good scientists, all of a sudden changed directions because his wife is a functional doctor, and that's where the money is. Dale Bredesen. So there's a difference between functional medicine and lifestyle medicine. Functional medicine has an answer to everything. Lifestyle medicine doesn't and says this is the general direction of health. And there is no scientific evidence for all those pills and all the holes. So the pattern that they take is that there are 30-something holes, and we'll do the lab tests in their labs. And then if you find certain deficits, by fixing it with this, X, Y, and Z, you will fix it. And the amount of money being spent is ridiculous. You literally don't have to pay anybody any money for the best health of your life. What we do in the clinics is sick care. Absolutely important. I mean, you're talking about I'm having back spasm. I did a pretty good job with the back spasm. Thank you and your ibuprofen. But it was necessary. I was paralyzed. They surgery. That's sick care. It's important. Healthcare is in your home and communities. And it doesn't take pills. It's a comprehensive lifestyle. Sorry, one little bit further. My grandfather, genius, brilliant. So he had them optimizing, right? Mental activity. But he didn't have the other things. So you have to do all of them. We used to go to Maryland for the hunting lodge, and he would have Coke and donuts. He would dip the donuts. Hemoglobin A1C of 12, and he would never walk because philosophers are not supposed to walk, I think. And so you can't do one thing, which is mental activity. You have to do all of them to protect yourself. And it's not going to come in an easy little protocol, a bunch of pills. A lot of information, but yeah.
Question over here.
I'm a faculty member of an internal medicine residency. I have an internal medicine residency program. How do we deal with encouraging our residents to have good stress while we're trying to decrease their bad stress?
Yes. Yeah, I'll repeat it. Residents and promoting good stress and reducing bad stress. There are some bad stress that you can't reduce, and it's personalized. In medical school, I hated histology. I still probably hate histology, but you have to do it. But it's about focusing on what's important to you. Just because you're in medical school or in residency, it doesn't mean that those things should go away. The central things that have purpose to you, have meaning to you, should be highlighted. Should never be pushed back to 8 years, 12 years. That has to be central. We have to speak. In fact, Loma Linda, I think, does a better job than other places. It's almost like we put everything on a break when we get into medical school, and actually from college, that chase with organic chemistry, and medical school, and then residency, and 16 years has gone by, and you've just parked your purpose to the side. You can't. It has to be central. And when it's central, there's a zero-sum economics to purpose or to stress. The good stress will actually push off the bad stress significantly from your consciousness. So what we can do is promote the idea of purpose being retained throughout your education. It cannot be delayed till after education. I think that's the most important thing we can do.
Question here. Orange first.
Let's hear it for Pittsburgh.
Yes.
In patients with Alzheimer's, what is the cause of death?
Falls, aspiration, sepsis. Yeah. A lot of falls. A lot of falls early, even prior to Alzheimer's, because a lot of times Alzheimer's patients seem healthy because they're thinner, because they started losing weight earlier, the sense of taste and all that. In any case, but their visuospatial properties are affected. So they're physically walking normal, but yet their ability to process space is affected. More falls, more broken bones, and all of that
So
follows.
there's not a pathologic process?
Not really.
going-
Later on in the disease, there's a concept called apraxia, where you forget what you could do before. I don't have apraxia for guitar, but I was always terrible at guitar. But if you knew guitar and you forget it, that's apraxia. You forget to swallow, so aspiration. You forget to, even the simple things, and that causes death.
One more question.
Okay. Wow, great. What, is this working?
Yell into it.
Hello.
I think they're just faking,
Can you
making
hear me
you.
now? Anyway, wow, great talk. And if you ever get tired of the health industry, go into preaching.
I'm ready. No.
Hey, a hot topic right now among kind of the lay public that's trying to get healthier is GMOs.
Yes.
You know, I mean, the amount of agriculture in the United States that's GMO produced is exponential in the last 20 years. And there's a lot of politics involved in it, you know, Monsanto versus the FDA and their collusion and all that. And it's a topic a lot of people up front just don't want to discuss, but without implicating anyone, can you give us your ideas on that?
Monsanto is a lot more powerful than I am, so I will not implicate anybody. Maybe I did already. But so GMOs, organic, all these concepts are important. How much, we don't know. I think there's a little bit of overstatement of our knowledge. And I hate the concept of extrapolating beyond the data. Some of these books actually do that. They extrapolate beyond the data for a reason. Because at the end of that data that they were extrapolated, there's some pills to sell. There's extrapolating beyond the data, and it's going on with GMOs. Definitely going on with a lot of other things. With organic, there's actually more and more data coming that when you get your food from true organic, and that's difficult to know. But when they did true organic versus non-organic, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, all of them, there was an effect. We're trying to figure that out. So, but at this point, there's plenty of data for these 5. Let's focus on that and push the edge of science to those realms as well. But not to the point where that becomes central. I always said one of the problems we have is when we overweigh a truth, as I tell my kids, it's not truth is not a problem. Everybody's telling the truth. From political, it's weight of truth. Complex. If you overweigh a truth, it's a fallacy. If I underweigh a truth, it's fallacy. It becomes fallacy. It becomes destructive. So fasting. Is fasting good for us? Yeah, no, there is. I mean, all the data that comes that shows that longevity and senescence genes has to do with low calorie, right? So fasting, we think at this point, besides autophagy and everything else, affects those genes, right? So it's good. But when you have this data that's going to affect heart disease, diabetes, brain diseases, and you can do this at public health level because it has been done at public health. Keto has never been done at public health level in the long term, ever. And then you bring the same weight with fasting. It's not that this is not true. You're overweighing the truth in comparison to what should be spoken about, which is cheap, free, whole food, plant-based, exercise, better sleep, stress management, and challenge your brain.
Thank you again. That was a pure demonstration of high-level resilience, your speech. Thank you very much. We appreciate that.